Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. And it's welcome to episode 33, and it's a warm welcome to the podcast. She is only about a mile or two as the crow flies from where I'm sitting in Cardiff in Wales. It's Kimberley Jones. How are you, Kimberley? Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Russell. Thanks for having me on. Now,
we're going to be talking about a project called Grief Space that you run in Caerau and Ely for an organisation called ACE, A-C-E, which stands for Action in Caerau and Ely, districts in the western part of Cardiff, the city of Cardiff. You work for ACE, but you're a Macmillan professional. So Macmillan will be a name that people are familiar with in the UK as a cancer charity. Tell us a little bit about your role.
So, as you mentioned, my role then is based at ACE, Action in Caerau and Ely. It is funded through Macmillan. So I'm classed as a Macmillan professional. And my role really is to, as a community development worker, explore how we might be able to use community development approaches to respond to death, dying and bereavement at a local level.
And it's probably important to say that, you know, we will be talking about death, dying, grief, bereavement, things like that. So if there is the need to, so there's probably the need to make it clear that, if any of these issues are triggering for you as a listener, just to let you know that in advance. Is that something you probably do that, generally during the course of your work as well, but it's something that probably needs to be said for this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that although it's one of the things that we're all going to experience firsthand and through family and friends, we have to be prepared and understand what we're talking about. And we will be talking about death and dying, and we'll be talking quite candidly about that. But more so in the sense of how people support each other throughout the grieving process. So we're not going to go into details necessarily about, specifics around death and dying, but more so how we can support each other and how really our society governs how we grieve during the loss of a loved one.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about community development, we'll talk about forms of oppression and discrimination and inequality and trying to kind of bring people together to take collective action against things that affect them and that they want to see changed and improved. I can think of one or two instances where we've talked about, or where the topic of death and dying have maybe figured, but only ever really peripherally, I suppose. Although I do remember working on a project encouraging women to go for breast screening appointments, where a lot of women were or the area was below the national average for attendance at breast screening appointments. And so clearly, cancer was in the background, I suppose, of those conversations and that project. It turned out to be very successful. But I don't think we ever really confronted the dying and the death bit, if I'm absolutely honest with you, for reasons that I'm sure we'll probably, perhaps we will touch on in very much in terms of how things are governed, as you say. But what struck me was the level of just sort of almost like just the almost the banality of how many people in that community would refer to knowing somebody with or having had cancer, and that struck me. And it's one of the things one of the experiences that has really, I find incredibly memorable through 20 plus years now of working in communities. That level of banality, everybody more or less seemed to know somebody who had cancer, experienced cancer, and in some cases 2 or 3 people in the same family unit, the same household. Such was the prevalence of it.
That statistic, I think it used to be, years ago, 1 in 4, then it was 1 in 3, and it's now 1 in 2 people will be affected by cancer. So, like you said, it's everywhere. Yeah. And if it's not you or a personal loved one, then it's a friend or, a friend of a friend. So everyone is affected in some shape or form, and absolutely everyone, death and dying.
I suppose to some extent, the frequency or the commonness of it was actually something that we were able to tap into in terms of that project, and what the people locally, they could all kind of, because of that, I guess, that ease of relating to it, it was easy, fairly straightforward to get people on board with the project and what we wanted to do. And we used informed volunteers to counsel, in inverted commas, women that perhaps were a little bit reticent about going. And one of the things that kind of cropped up was, almost like, well, is there any point in going for the screening? Because, well, I know so many people who will have breast cancer that, well, chances are I'll get it anyway. Do I need to be told I'm going to get it or have it? And again, that banality, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but and I'm certainly not judging people for thinking in these ways. It did strike me quite a formative moment in my career. But there was an awful lot of brevity. There was a lot of laughing, I remember, in that project. And I remember the local rugby team for the season ended up inviting their opponents, when they were hosting home games, to bring a bra. And of course, I had this fantastic situation where all these kind of big, rugged, burly rugby players were rocking up at the rugby club, and they ended up hanging these bras from the crossbar of the rugby posts. And so again, they're all kind of lined up under, if they conceded a try or scored a try, you've got all these burly rugby players lined up under this crossbar, waiting for the conversion, with all of these bras hanging above them. And it was about trying to create some of that levity as well, I suppose, and to make it something that we could talk about and confront.
Absolutely, and it's take away the fear of it to a certain degree, to be able to say, we know it happens, and this is with breast cancer or with death and dying, whatever it might be, we know it happens, but it's scary. Okay, so how do we make it more accessible? How do we find language that fits the situation that we're in? And if you've never been in that situation before, or the first experience you have of cancer is through a GP or a consultant or whoever it might be, that language is not always accessible, or it doesn't quite match up to how you're feeling.
Yeah.
There's a disconnect, and GPs and professionals are getting better at this and understanding this more. We use jargon all the time without even thinking about it. But I think that idea of, I don't know, having bras on the rugby posts, it takes away the taboo, doesn't it? It sort of says, look, we can do this. We can have this conversation. It's not as scary as sometimes we think it might be. And we can have a laugh. It's one of the first things I say when I welcome people to Grief Space. You can laugh, you can cry, you can get angry, just don't flip any tables.
Yeah. Incidentally, that example with the rugby club, it ended up morphing into discussions around male cancers, testicular, prostate, for example. And again, that encouraging men to be a little bit more self-aware of their bodies and to look for lumps and things like that as well. So it ended up growing far beyond what we originally set out to do. Okay, enough about what I've done with rugby clubs and bras. Anybody listening to this is going to think, what the hell am I talking about? So Grief Space, the word space is quite deliberately used there, isn't it? So I'm creating that opportunity to bring people together. The elephant in the room, perhaps, if I interpret what listeners might be thinking, is, well, has this been informed primarily, almost exclusively, by the pandemic and the impact that has had, certainly in terms of death and, or at the very least, chronic illness for many people? Or is it something that was being delivered as a project or being discussed before the pandemic?
So it's really interesting, actually. This project was in the pipeline pre-pandemic, and ACE had applied for this funding, so it was a tendered process. They applied for the funding well before, it would have been 2019. And I was going through the process of being interviewed and got the job, and was lucky enough to be accepted in that role. And my start date, my very first day, was the 23rd of March 2020. Okay, so we'll all remember that day, or most people remember that day, is the day we went into that first lockdown. And that corresponded with my first day in post that was looking at a community response to death, dying and bereavement. And I went, oh, this timing is, I don't even know what I thought, whether it was perfect or not perfect, but it was what it was. And that happened on, Monday, the 23rd of March. And so it inevitably was governed by the pandemic. And one of the reasons that I set up Grief Space, or it became a concept, is that other services and other providers and other charities had to refocus efforts, and most went down the route of offering telephone support on a one-to-one basis. Now, as a community development worker and seeing and chatting to people in the community, there was something missing. Okay, and it's that peer support, that shared experience, that storytelling, that element of connection with community was missing from the one-to-one support. It's absolutely needed. Bereavement counselling absolutely needed to happen on a one-to-one basis for many, many people. But majority of people just want to be listened to, and that's not necessarily needed at a level of a professional level. So that was kind of some of the context behind why I wanted to set up a peer bereavement support group. And initially we did that, we opted to use Zoom, that platform that we're all more than familiar with now. And that was because most people were either using it for work or they were using it for that family quizzes and all those sort of fun things that we try to put in place to keep us sane and connected. But for me, the key factors was Zoom was free and it was accessible. So yeah, initially we were very much governed by the pandemic. It was set up to be an online peer bereavement support group. It has now morphed into a group that meets on a weekly basis in person. But again, that's been governed by COVID restrictions. So we have an outdoor space which is covered and has heaters, and we have blankets, and we have to wash the blankets at a certain level and make sure everything's clean and sanitized. So it's definitely been shaped and morphed throughout the past, how long has it been? Almost 2 years now.
And what does the role of a community organisation then like ACE bring to this? Because presumably Macmillan, as a national kind of UK cancer charity, is well resourced and has structures and all the rest of that, and certainly the expertise and the professional expertise in these things. But there seems to be a particular logic to why a community organisation is being partnered with then, if that's the right way of putting it, in respect of this project. So what does ACE bring to the table as that community organisation, that community-owned organisation?
So I think for me, it's about doing things on a local basis. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here in terms of community development workers, but it's about looking at what does our community need, but actually what does our community already have? What have we got at our disposal? So it's that age-old sort of what's strong and not what's wrong approach that ACE really takes. So it was looking at what have we got in our community? And we have a huge amount of people who have experience. We have a huge amount of people who have had cancer or who have supported someone or who are carers or who have lost somebody. And grief is such an isolating, or can be such an isolating experience. Some people turn in and they don't look out elsewhere. And I think that having connection to community, whether that's through a weekly group or somewhere to go to have a cup of tea every so often, that is what ACE can offer. It's a starting point, it's connection. And we know the ripple effects that connection to community has. It's increased social interactions, increased confidence, increased skills, all those sorts of things. So by placing a bereavement peer support group within a community centre that is down the road from where you live, that is accessible, that you've perhaps been to a few times before to visit the cafe, perhaps you've been to the gardening group, and if not, it works the other way round. You might go for bereavement, but you might be connected then with the benefits advice that we do, or the food bank, or the pantry service that we run. So it's all about expanding that support network and not treating this in isolation, because it's not, we're people, and we need to be looked at holistically, and we have holistic needs. Most people aren't just affected by grief. They might be affected by monetary problems that have come with the loss of someone. They might be the sole parent now and unable to perhaps bring in the money that they were bringing in before. So we're not perfect little things that can fit into perfect little boxes. And I think that real community local approach is why this fits so nicely into ACE, I think.
Resonates a lot with the last episode of the preceding episode to this with Martin Webber around the community enhanced social prescribing model that he's developing at the University of York with partners at University of Central Lancashire as well, in that sense that the connections and the social interactions the community can provide can help bring about health outcomes for individuals, but also, what can individuals bring to the community, and what needs perhaps in terms of social prescribing approaches and initiatives, what needs to be invested in communities,
yes,
in order for it to keep being able to accommodate and sustain social approaches, community and communal approaches of this nature. So again, it seems to be hardwired into this.
Well, most of our referrals come through social prescribing route, actually. People who are perhaps presenting at the GP are connected through our wellbeing connectors, then are invited. Essentially, I have a conversation with them over the phone about grief space and what it is and what we do and how it might work, and I find out a little bit about that person. But yeah, I would say about 70-80% of our participants at Grief Space have been socially prescribed. The other thing that ACE brings to it really is we've got a really great connection with our local doctors and our GPs in our local cluster. They know about ACE. We've been working with the GP cluster for a long, long time, and we are able and hope in the future to be able to see the benefits of hard facts of referring someone over to Grief Space perhaps reduces how many times they visit the GP a year, perhaps reduces their need for medication, perhaps reduces, all those other things. So, yeah, absolutely, ripple effects.
Yeah. If someone's listening to this and they're, many hundreds, thousands of miles away from Cardiff, what's the likelihood that there might be a similar sort of setup, a similar sort of project in their neighbourhood or in their vicinity? Is this common, these bereavement cafes?
I don't know. It's the short and sweet answer to that. I would love to see it happen. I have this perfect image of it being franchised and people taking it on and making it their own, and perhaps doing it for specific types of loss or specific religions or whatever it might be. It's a model that can absolutely be used. And you don't need to be a professional to run it. You have to be compassionate and understanding and listen, and maybe make a really good cup of tea or bring some cake from time to time. But everything that I bring to the group is human values. Is that idea of I've had experience where I didn't feel supported. So how have I turned my own personal experience into how can we support others? So if there's not something, there might be a time or there might be someone that might be willing to take on this sort of thing.
I suppose a similar question then is somebody might be listening to this and they could find themselves either in personal or professional capacity thinking, okay, some of these are issues that resonate with me because of, things going on in my life now. Again, may not be able to come to Ely or Caerau, to the Grief Space project, but what might be some practical things that people do? You talk about tea and cake, and it's amazing how much community development starts with tea and cake. But that sense that, well, what might I need to, or how might I go about beginning to look at and set up something similar?
As I said, it almost comes down to your personal experience. And I think what is really key to how Grief Space works is how it works. We invite people to come along. We absolutely understand that we can't change how someone is feeling. We can't make it better. We can't bring that person back. But what we can do is turn up and listen and share. And when you share your story and you listen to others, it can help us realise that what we're feeling or not feeling is normal. And what we do is we challenge that usual approach of sort of offering platitudes or that idea of fixing each other. We want to help. When we see someone who is in pain, whether that's from the loss of a loved one or an illness or whatever it might be, we want to help. We're human. So it's natural for us to want to protect others. Sometimes when we do that, we actually have the opposite effect. So for example, when it comes to grieving, I think we're told so often about how we should be feeling. So it's been, 3 months, it's been 5 years, you shouldn't be feeling like this anymore. The person that's died would want you to be happy. Everything happens for a reason, all those sorts of things. They're not necessarily true. And what it does is it shuts down that conversation. So if every time you try to open up to someone and that person gets uncomfortable, or if you cry, they tell you to stop and be strong and have a positive attitude, that person will stop coming to you. And they'll start thinking, I must be crazy, or what's wrong with me, or why aren't I over this? And I hate that saying, move on, because you never move on. You might move forward, but you're never over it. You never, fully move on. And I think that when we get out of that idea of wanting to fix someone or thinking someone needs to be fixed, because we're not broken. And that idea of telling someone how to get over it. So you need counselling, you need medication, you need to, I don't know, get a grip or distract yourself with work. Those are all things that we say because we think it's going to help. But actually what probably would have been better is sitting there saying, this is awful. I don't know what to say. I can't fix it. I can't make it better, but I'm going to sit with you and I'm going to listen. I think if people want to set up groups, you've got to come in to it from that angle. I'm not a professional. I don't have the answers. No one has all the answers. But individuals know what will work best for them. And that can take months of trying. And what works one month might not work the next month. But it's that continual change, that continual navigation of your grief. And by having a group that people can come to, there's no guilt attached to saying it's 5 years down the line and I still don't sleep well, or I still don't do this, because you're not hurting the other person. If you're saying that to, I don't know, your mother, your brother, your friend, their worry increases.
But it's a variation on that theme around, what is often done to communities, what agencies think communities need, rather than actually spending time in and with them to find out what it is that people think the community needs. Or, like you said at the towards the start, identifying what is strong and investing in that and building on that, rather than what is wrong. So again, I mean, I'm almost kind of confessing a little bit here. There's more to do with community development practice with the project than is necessarily obvious when you first, hear about the project, which I remember finding out about and thinking, wow, okay, I didn't realise that was necessarily a thing.
I think that community setting is key, though, isn't it? Like when someone is pregnant or having a child or something, everyone's there offering advice. So this is sometimes not, it's unsolicited, but everyone is there. And if you need anything, I'll be, if you need a shop, or if you need, I don't know, more baby grows. I don't have children. I don't know if you could tell. So absolutely scrambling here. But we don't always have that necessarily at the end of life. So you don't always have that community connection. You have antenatal classes or wherever it might be. You don't have anything like that to prepare you for how do I support someone who's at the end of life? How do I prepare, I'm already feeling grief and my person's still here. What is this? Why am I feeling like this? Why am I, upset, or why am I reacting in this way? And there's that lack of conversation, that lack of language. And it absolutely needs to be at community level, because we don't need everything from professionals. There's absolutely a time and a place for bereavement counselling and more sort of specialist services, absolutely. But there's also a space for holding space for your neighbour, having those conversations, understanding when is the time to listen and when is the time to not fix. Shut up and listen.
Yeah, to get out of the way almost and just let the healing happen. The contrast with the start of life and pregnancy, I think, is absolutely brilliant and so evidently the case as well. I mean, again, it's almost kind of like woods for the trees thing here. I've 3 kids of my own, exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, it's a marked contrast, I guess, then in comparison to end of life care.
And this is a sort of, we're going off on a tangent a little bit, but it's hard not to sometimes. I think it's quite interesting, the contrast, because when people have birth plans, it's not this is exactly what is going to happen and this is how things are going to go. You kind of have, this is what I want to have happen, this is what I anticipate is going to happen, but if X, Y and Z happen, then these are my backups. And I think that when we're thinking about people who are end of life or who have an understanding or a terminal illness, we don't have those conversations necessarily. We talk, you might have heard the phrase a good death, what is a good death? But I think when you're planning for that, it has to be the same approach. It has to be, okay, this is what I want, this is an ideal, but pain medication might be needed, or something else might be needed, or actually I wanted to be at home, but that's not realistic because I can't fit the bed in my house. Whatever it might be, there's got to be backup plans. But we're too, I don't know, we don't have those conversations.
And it's become quite salient, isn't it? of late in the UK, because of course we've gone through some difficulties at the minute with respect to these parties that Prime Minister was involved in and things like that, and people are citing the loneliness and the difficulty in which they were saying goodbye to loved ones and paying their last respects, and perhaps not being able to do it in a physical sense, not being able to be with people in their final moments in hospitals and hospices and care homes and the rest of it. Those precious final moments, that process through which people are saying goodbye to loved ones has become almost, sort of headlines in themselves.
I think it can complicate grief. If you have, and we all have expectations of how a funeral might look for someone, of how, if someone's been unwell for a long time, they might have had advanced care planning in place to have a think about where they'd like to die. They might have opted to die at home, but actually the pandemic has meant they've died alone in hospital beds with amazing staff and support from those care professionals, but missing holding their loved one's hand. And it is frustrating, and without getting political, it is frustrating. But you look at the Queen; it's a perfect example. She sat there on her own after her husband of however many years had died, and she sat at his funeral alone. And we see, I've seen it in the communities. I've seen people not be able to visit, not have the funeral they expected, have a funeral of 5 or 6 people, have to think about who should be at the funeral, and then how do you create a hierarchy or an invite list for a funeral?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we often talk about in terms of community development things like phrases like capacity building. To what extent, I wouldn't expect you to betray any confidences, but to what extent have people maybe come through the group having started as someone seeking some of that support, but now maybe have adopted, more of a facilitative role and is hosting and welcoming people to that group, or maybe helping people out in the community to signpost them to the group? To what sort of extent has there been that sort of journey, if that's not too hackneyed a phrase?
It is happening. So what I really like about the group is it's not a course or anything like that. You don't have to come week in, week out. You come when you want, and you share as little or as much as you want. So some people might come, and I've had this happen, come the first time and think, I'm not going to share, I'm just going to sit and listen, and maybe I'll have the confidence. I've had people where the opposite happens, where they've come, I'm not going to share this time, and then within 10 minutes they've told us their story, and they are sharing things that they've never shared before. But what I am seeing is the more people that are coming back time and time again, whether that's every week or here and there when they feel that they need it, they're taking more of a role. And at the beginning of the session, we talk about, those listening, those compassions, we're not fixing those. So there's a reminder at the beginning of every session. So we're creating that culture where we're not fixing people. We're sitting, we're sharing, we're witnessing what they're feeling. And you can see that coming out in people's responses. So someone might share and someone else might come back and say, wow, I don't know what to say, but I'm really glad you shared that with us. Can I tell you about an experience that I had that was fairly similar? So we're starting to see that. And it's lovely because I become more and more redundant. And as a community development worker, I view that as my job. My job is to help set people help things up, a little bit of facilitation, get people confident, get people understanding and navigating and moulding what the aim is, so it becomes theirs. And then it's theirs then to take in whatever direction they choose. So the sessions where I say very, very little are the sessions that I think are the best.
Yeah, and again, anyone listening to this probably can relate that experience and draw those parallels with other things, whether it's around community learning, whether it's around about volunteering, whether it's around about mental health activities, work, helping people with addiction and all the rest of it. Yeah, absolutely. More in common with a project like Grief Space, with bereavement cafes, than perhaps people, certainly myself, would initially think perhaps really is the case. And so therefore, I suppose to extrapolate further from that is that actually, if people think that this is something that does need to be developed in their communities, with their communities, then actually the skill set, they probably do have the basics
Absolutely.
in place. There isn't necessarily this specialist sort of knowledge and training in palliative care or anything like that, or counselling, for example. Maybe there's a bit more that they already have, being asset-based, than perhaps they realise.
100%.
Yeah. My final question is, I think it's fair to say, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but Ely and Caerau in Cardiff are predominantly sort of white working class communities. And I suppose there's an increasing secularism within those sorts of communities. To what extent might this look different if we were in areas where faith of any denomination, where there are stronger, larger kind of congregations or connections that are based on faith? Would there be something similar happening within all those already existing kind of networks and structures?
So I think it's important to note that as well as Ely and Caerau, we do also work with people in the communities of Riverside, Canton and Pontcanna. So that's where our cluster, sort of our 11 GPs surgeries are based. So we have got quite diverse communities within that. But when I look around the grief space room, it does represent or reflect really that the more Ely and Caerau communities, perhaps more that white working class. One of the things that we do as community development workers is we say, right, well, who's missing? Who's not here? And why aren't they here? And I think that is historical. I think that there's a number of reasons for that. If you look to any GP surgery, any NHS list, any major cancer charity, the same communities are underrepresented. Right. But what I really see happening, or what I would love to see happening here, is this is a model that, like I said, that could be franchised, that could be picked up and manipulated and used in every type of community, because it is based on those human values. It's based on compassion, it's based on understanding, it's based on listening, and it doesn't matter who leads these groups, because we all share that. I think it would be beneficial or interesting to think about how, for my role, how could I just support a few different key volunteers or a few key different people, whether that's faith-based, whether that's to do with a specific condition, whether that's to do with age, whatever it might be. Perhaps my role is to think about how I can support people to set those things up. To set up their own grief space that is specific to their specific needs, whether that's on a local basis or a needs basis. Could we have a grief space for young people? Could we have grief space for people of a Muslim background? Could we have grief space for people who are affected by the death of a sibling? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, we can.
If someone's listening to this, assuming that you would welcome them getting in touch, but they wanted to kind of hear a little bit more about it, get beneath the skin of it a little bit more, what would be the best way of getting in touch?
So the best way would probably to give us a call. So if you just popped in ACE Action in Caerau and Ely into Google, our website will come up and all our details are on there, and there's further details about where Grief Space fits into. So it fits into the ACE Compassionate Communities project. So there's a number of other things that we do as well relating to death, dying and bereavement, but all that information is on the website, and I'd be really happy to have conversations with whoever might be interested, whether that's a professional or someone who's thinking about coming along themselves.
And ACE has quite a wide range and portfolio of different projects taking place, but they were all very much built on asset-based approaches, very much alert to the opportunity to co-produce projects, co-produce interventions with people, and encourage people to get in touch with ACE generally across the piece with everything that they do.
Absolutely.
They're a terrific organisation and a true asset to Cardiff, well, certainly to Caerau and Ely, and I'll drop all of that in the show notes as well. So really grateful for your time, Kimberley. We've had any number of dates in the calendar to get this done, but I'm really pleased we've done it as well, because I like to think there's always something that I learn when recording these, and invariably there is. If I'm honest, there's probably more in relation to this project, in relation to this episode, than most, and I'm personally grateful for that, as well as your time. And like you said, it's one that we are all going to encounter at some point. There's no point pretending otherwise, I don't suppose. Yeah, thanks once again, and really best of luck with everything you do. And I think it's a terrific project, and probably bringing a huge amount of meaning to people's lives at a difficult time for them as well. And as I said, all credit to you.
Thanks, Russell. I could honestly talk about this for hours and days, so I'm quite impressed that we've got it down to such a short time. So.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at comdevtpodcast, COMMDEVT podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the CD podcast.